Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Thursday webinar in the Hub. Today, I apologize now if anything goes wrong. I'm in a different location. Hopefully it should all work, but yeah, we'll keep an eye on things. So today we're joined by Lottie Galpin, and we've got a really interesting talk coming up about beyond ableism and inspiration porn, representing disability in ELT materials. Lottie, this is a passion of Lottie's. She's a freelance editor and writer. And one of the things that I love from your blog, from your website, you say, you help publishers to avoid embarrassing diversity and inclusion errors. And I think this is a topic that a lot of people are interested in finding out more about how we can do these things effectively, and it's not just token image of a person in a wheelchair, which tends to be the easy option. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lottie. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, so pop any questions in there for us.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Teresa. Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, as Teresa said, my name is Lottie Galpin, and I use the pronouns she and her. And today I want to talk to you about representing disability in ELT materials. And clearly, you know, this is a huge topic. We're not going to cover everything in 45 minutes, but I want to kind of lay the foundations to help you to start thinking about this topic, if you're not already. What I want to kind of look at as a key concept is that what we tend to do now is we create a non-disabled and ableist norm, and we pop in bits of representation of disability. And I think that's where a lot of the problem lies. And that's where we end up with these kind of tokenistic representations. The other thing I want to look at is kind of how we go about representing people, and how we often default to stereotypical representations, including things like inspiration porn. So those two terms, ableism and inspiration porn, I'll clear up as we go along. So let's have a look at what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start by thinking about what disability is. We're going to look at two ways of understanding disability, two models of disability. And then we're going to look at impairments. So impairments are typically what I describe using the word disability. An impairment is something like asthma or diabetes. So we're going to look at what kinds of impairments come under the umbrella of disability. We're going to have a think about why representation matters. We're going to look at a few do's and don'ts for representing disability. And we're also going to consider how to represent visible and invisible disabilities with artwork, texts, and audio. So before I get going, Teresa, I'd like to just ask a question of everyone, assuming there's people there. I would like to know what the mix of people watching are in terms of jobs. So if they could pop editor, writer, teacher in the comments, that would help me direct what I'm talking about today.
Fantastic. Yep, we've got a few people watching, a couple of hello messages so far. Yeah, so for me personally, whilst we're waiting for the comments to come in, I would say now I'm more of a materials writer. Don't do as much teaching as I would perhaps like. Hugh has said he's a language coach, and he's also hearing impaired.
Okay, hi.
And Silvina, who did the webinar a couple of weeks ago, she is a teacher and materials writer.
Oh, hi, Silvina.
And Olivia, a teacher who likes posting lesson plans on her blog.
Okay, all right. Okay, brilliant. That's really useful to know. So we're going to start by looking at some nitty-gritty, some key concepts we need to understand about disability, and then we're going to move forward once we've got those established. So there are lots of different models of disability, but I think two that are key in terms of understanding what disability is, in terms of how we represent it in the media, how we represent it in ELT materials, are the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. So the medical model of disability is kind of the traditional one, where we say people are disabled by their impairments or their differences. And we look at what's wrong with the person, not what the person needs. So it's saying that the impairment is a problem. It needs to be fixed. The social model of disability, which was developed by disabled people, says that people aren't disabled by their impairment or their difference, but by barriers in society. So they could be physical, attitudinal, institutional. So if we think about a wheelchair user, a physical barrier would be something like a lack of physical accessibility. Attitudinal might be something like reduced expectations of that person or discrimination. Institutional barriers might be something like how the legal system creates barriers or makes the world more accessible to people. And then the final concept I want to have a quick look at is ableism. So the dictionary definition of this is the unfair treatment of disabled people by giving jobs or other advantages to non-disabled people. And clearly this fits more with the medical model of disability. So it's more of a traditional kind of discriminatory view. If you're being ableist, you're discriminating, you're creating barriers for disabled people. So this is a term that's going to come up through the talk, and I just wanted to make sure everybody understood before we go forward. The next thing I want to look at is what we put under this umbrella of disability. So what I'm using here is UK law, UK descriptions of disability, but the World Health Organization, the UN use kind of similar like definitions of what comes under this umbrella of disability. So as you said, Teresa, quite often when we're representing disability materials, the default that we go to is to represent wheelchair users, but there are a lot more kinds of disability that we could represent. So under this umbrella, we have things like brain and body injuries, sensory impairments like hearing loss, organ-specific impairments like asthma or heart disease, progressive impairments, for example, dementia, fluctuating and things with fluctuating and recurring effects like fibromyalgia, neurodiversity, so things like ADHD and autism, mental illness and mental health conditions, learning disabilities, and autoimmune conditions, for example, lupus. So I'd like you just to, I wouldn't expect you to absorb all of these different conditions right now, but I'd just keep that in mind as we go through and think about how we represent disability currently in ELT materials. And bear in mind that, when we talk about disability, we're not talking about this homogenous group of people. We're talking about lots of diverse conditions, and within each kind of impairment, there may be a community with diverse views. So if we think about autism, for example, there's differences within the autism community about how they perhaps want to be identified, and how they identify themselves. So it's not a huge homogenous group. It's a group of lots of different people encompassing lots of diversity. So for those people who are watching, I want you just to think about this question. And if you feel comfortable doing so, could you post your answers in the chat, and Teresa will tell me what you say. So why is it important to represent disabled people in educational materials?
A very good question. We've a while back we were talking in the hub about I think Dan used the word, is it anodyne? Mm-hmm. ELT materials tend to be quite happy and show kind of I don't want to say a nice view of the world, but in the past, it was always middle class, people who were in good situations. They didn't really, even things like homelessness weren't topics which were really covered. So just whilst we're waiting for people to chat, I would say one thing is that probably a lot of our students are affected perhaps not personally, but by perhaps someone in their family has a disability. And so we need to provide them with the language to talk about it rather than not or ignoring it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. To be able to talk about yourself or to be able to describe people in your family. Yeah, 100%.
Hugh says representation matters. People need to see themselves, and we need to see challenges others face and adapt to.
Brilliant. Any other thoughts?
It's important. Silvina says it's important to represent all people, so disabled people fit this concept.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, brilliant. So shall we have a look at what I think? So if we think about inclusive materials in general, I want to think about what a textbook or what educational materials mean to a student. When we're giving a student a textbook, there's a sort of authority to it because it comes from an educational context, whether that be a handout we give them as teachers, or whether that be a textbook that we create as editors and writers. There's an authority to it because of the educational context, because it's coming from teachers from the school. And textbooks establish a kind of normal, don't they? I mean, I don't know about you, but when I was learning French at school, because it was pre-internet, my only understanding of France before I went there was from Tricolore 1. They're presenting very much an understanding of what is normal in the world. And this normality, it can include or it can exclude. If students can see themselves in those materials, it follows logically that they're going to be more engaged with those materials. They're going to be more engaged with the educational process. And the kind of converse is, if you don't see yourself, maybe you're not going to engage very much with those materials, perhaps even with the subject or the experience of education. If you don't feel included, if you don't feel it's relevant to you, why would you engage? And so it's helpful for those people we're representing, but I also think it's helpful, as I think Silvina said, like it's helpful for everybody, because we need to learn about different lived experiences, and by learning about those different lived experiences, we learn to become better global citizens. We learn those kind of 21st century skills of empathy and understanding. So representation matters in a general sense because it can include or exclude, and it can help educate all of us a little bit better about the world. But if we think about groups that are typically marginalized, the theme of representation comes up again and again and again. And I like this quote from Gillian Mercado, who's an activist, actor, and model. They say, "I've always seen people like myself who have a visible or invisible disability portrayed as lesser than on screen. It's unfair because representation matters so much when you're growing up and not seeing yourself reflected back, especially in the disabled community where there's already a stigma that we're not worth much." So one typical stereotype of disability is a stereotype of omission, that people just aren't there. And the impact of not including people, you can see from this quote, is quite significant. It helps to, or encourages stigma, or fails to reduce stigma, and it has a real effect on the people who are not being represented. And I think if we look at this figure here, that really hits home. So around 15% of the world's population, or an estimated 1 billion people, live with disabilities. They're the world's largest minority. So failure to include them within ELT materials is really quite significant. And if we think about what our standard ELT materials look like, certainly not 15% of the people, we're certainly not representing 15% of the people as disabled. And I'm not saying that, we should follow a formula or an algorithm to ensure that 15% of the people are exactly, disabled, but I just want to make the point that we're really failing to hit that kind of representation. So, and I think Teresa and I discussed this before we came on, there's a real will to do this, but people are not quite sure how to do it. And I think that what we need to do is make a shift from a kind of ableist or non-disabled norm in our materials, where I've mentioned we pop in these bits of representation. And we need to accept and understand that the world is composed of disabled and non-disabled people, and we simply need to reflect that. So it's not rocket science, it's just that understanding that the world is non-disabled and disabled, within that with the diversity of the disabled community, and we're just reflecting that. We're creating a reality that reflects that the world contains disabled and non-disabled people. So I have another question. What examples of disability have you seen personally in ELT materials?
I was thinking about this recently because I think in the most recent starters and Cambridge starters, movers, flyers, in some of the images, like in the listening, there's an activity where they have to match the names to the people. And I think there were children in wheelchairs. This is going back to the, that's an obvious way to include someone. So that's something that I've noticed so far.
That's good though. I mean, I hate to say this, but it is better than it not being there, but we just could, we could do a bit better. Any comments from anyone?
Nothing as yet. We've still got a few people following along, but obviously as well, a lot of people are producing their own materials, like Peter J. Fulligar. He's doing a lot of perhaps not on the disability side, but more inclusive and diverse materials.
But I think, I know Peter well, and I know that this is a topic that he really cares about as well. And I think if you look at his material, you'll certainly see some really nice representations of disability included. Shall we move on?
Yeah, I don't know whether there's been no comments because nobody's seen any.
Nobody's there.
Could be a sign of the times.
Yeah, okay. All right, so let's move on. So I think what we currently do, as I've mentioned, we have this non-disabled norm. We have limited representations of disability, so we go for wheelchair users as default. So if we think back to that earlier slide where we have these many different types of impairments, representing wheelchair users only is not doing the job. It's not representing disability kind of naturally and authentically with all its diversity. I think what we tend to do is we have limited topics as well. So we might see disability come up in pockets, and it might be with certain topics. So the Paralympian, the disabled business person who did it in spite of all the adversity. So we tend to just rely on having it in kind of typical places. The other thing we tend to do is we focus on disability. We focus on the impairment. So rather than seeing a whole human being with lots of different facets of themselves, people immediately just pick some representations focus specifically on the disability. And I mean, if we think about this in the context of describing myself, if someone were to write a text about me and it were to start, Lottie Galpin is an editor who wears glasses. Despite wearing glasses, she has managed to have a successful freelance career. It's absurd when you think about it in those terms. Or if we were to supplant, the disability, if we were to replace that with any other form of marginalization and say, in spite of that, they have done well, it would be considered so incredibly offensive. So why we allow that to happen with disability seems very strange to me. The final thing I think we tend to do is we focus on certain tropes and stereotypes. So disabled people are passive, disabled people require help, disabled people are inspiring, they only succeed in spite of, their only value is being there because they succeed in spite of their impairment. So, I don't want to be horribly unfair. There are good representations out there, but just to look at some of the negative ones, these are kind of trends that we do see. So the idea of looking at disabled people as inspiring is problematic. And I think this quote here from Stella Young, who is a comedian and journalist, really kind of sums it up. So At a TED talk in 2014, which I would recommend watching, I am not your inspiration, thank you very much. She said, I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to tell you that we've been lied to about disability. Yeah, we've been sold the lie that disability is a bad thing, capital B, capital T. It's a bad thing, and to live with disability makes you exceptional. It's not a bad thing, and it doesn't make you exceptional. So I think one of the big tropes that we rely on is to include disabled people simply because they represent inspiration to non-disabled people. And that's fundamentally problematic. And I think that that comes from the idea that we have this disabled norm, that the baseline is non-disabled. And that's simply not the case. If 15% of the world are disabled, then some of our students, some of our users are going to be disabled. And it makes no sense to work from a non-disabled baseline. So how can we represent disability better? So as I've said before, we want to avoid that non-disabled norm, stereotypes and ableist tropes. We want to represent disability throughout a book, or if you're using, if you're a teacher creating your own materials, try to make sure that you consistently represent disability in different ways throughout your materials, because if it just comes up now and again, it's going to start to feel tokenistic. Remember, there's diversity within the disabled communities, so represent a range of visible, invisible impairments and different types of people. Remember that, you know, disabled people are people, so they're going to be of different ethnicities. They're going to have different hobbies and likes and dislikes. They might have tattoos. They might be members of the LGBTQIA communities. So it's really important to remember that there's diversity within disability. Also take a person-first approach, so focus on the person and not the impairment. And finally, show disabled people as active and independent people, so rather than that passive stereotype, and to show disabled people authentically, naturally, just living everyday lives. If, you know, it's part of that idea of having a unified reality of non-disabled and disabled people. Disabled people are just people and should be included into any and all of the content, naturally, incidentally, authentically living their everyday lives. And I think this photo is does quite a nice job of kind of summing that, that idea up. So we have got somebody who uses a mobility scooter. We've got a mix of ethnicity, and we've just got somebody hanging out with a friend, living their everyday life. And that's the kind of focus I think that we want to go for. We're just including people naturally, authentically living their everyday lives. So I thought we could have a quick look at artwork before we move on to looking at texts. So we've got two images here, and these images I think are something that teachers could use in their own materials, or that you know, editors and writers, if you're briefing activities, you can use them in textbooks as well. And these images I'll provide a list of links for photo banks that represent disability at the end, but these are from specific non-traditional photo banks, and images like this are quite overt in their focus on disability. We can see, you know, a wheelchair user, we can see their prosthetic quite clearly, but these would work really nicely anywhere in a textbook. So if you have a vocab set with, say, 8 items, 1 or 2, 3 of these items the photos could represent disabled people. So here, this would be great for, you know, representing the phrase hang out with friends, or be in a relationship. This one would be great for something like, you know, put the dishes away, or, you know, tidy up. But these would also work well just as decorative images within a textbook, or within, you know, a reading text, or for a listening activity. So I think artwork's a really simple, easy way of bringing that representation in, and we can do it in this quite overt way.
Talking about, sorry to interrupt. Talking about, you said that these come from, well, these aren't from Shutterstock or one of those big companies. Have you noticed a shift in these bigger companies that a lot of the publishers tend to use in terms of the images that they have? Because often, you know, you'll type in looking for a diverse image and it tends to be, you know, an individual in a wheelchair, perhaps looking sad, or I don't know, the focus seems to be very much still on the disability rather than these images, which are beautiful and just show people living their lives.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, some photo banks are getting better. I think Getty's better. So if you're an editor or a writer and you're looking for images that you can send to your publisher as reference, I would go to Getty. iStock also, Shutterstock do have some. If you're searching for images, I would go with the activity first. So instead of disability plus job, I would go job and then maybe disability afterwards. Job, man, I don't know, vet, disability, because I think the focus disability first kind of defaults to disability as a stock search. I don't know if that's helpful. Okay, so we can, getting back to where we were, we can represent disability quite overtly like this, or we can represent it more kind of implicitly in the background of images. So we've got two images here from this site, which I absolutely love, Disabled and Here, which is a great one if you're a teacher. So this image here represents someone with diabetes, checking their insulin levels, and you can just see that they're in a natural everyday situation, and just that representation of disability is very subtle, but also realistic and authentic. And then likewise in this image here, we've got just a picture of some medication, which could be for, you know, it could be for a mental health challenge, or it could be for another condition. But it's just a little subtle nod to disability. And we can do this also with the background of images. You know, you could have assistive devices visible in the background of images, or, you know, things like grab bars in bathrooms. If you're briefing a bathroom scene, you know, think about putting grab bars in there. So it's just really considering how you can integrate small representations of disability into artwork. So if you're an author or an editor, you can brief this for the illustrator to create, or you can search for images which do this. If you're a teacher, you might want to think about creating, you know, drawing some of these yourselves based on real life images. Or, you know, you can also look for photo banks like Disabled and Here, which are good for that kind of thing. Another way we can use the background or use artwork to represent disability kind of implicitly is to look at the environment and inclusive environments. So this is a photo of my local designer outlets, and you can see some really nice examples of accessible environments. So we've got ramps here, we've got tactile paving, disabled parking spaces. So if you're a writer or editor briefing artwork, consider looking at how you can make the environment that you're representing more accessible. So if it's a street scene and there's not an ELT book in history that hasn't had a street scene in it, you know, consider having tactile paving or ramps. If you're showing shops, you know, are they disabled accessible? Do they have a door for wheelchair users? If you're representing a school or a building, you know, does it have lifts or ramps? So just consider where in images you can represent accessible environments, inclusive environments. And then again, if you're a teacher, you might want to go out and take images, take photos like I did of things in real life that you can incorporate into your materials. A good way, I think, to start thinking about this is just to start looking around you. You know, like if you're a non-disabled person, you don't realize how much disability influences the world until you start looking. And then you notice that there are lots of accessible environments everywhere. Okay, so I'm very mindful of time. We've got about 10 minutes, haven't we, Teresa? Yeah. Okay, so I want to have a quick look at how we use text and audio. And I want to start with what I think is a pretty standard way that we represent disability. We'll have a text about a disabled person. And I've gone for ELT favourite, Helen Keller. Has there been a course, an ELT course without her? I don't know. So I'd like, if there's anyone still there, to have ask people to read. So take 2 minutes, read both texts and tell me which one you think is a better, more inclusive, more representative way of talking about Helen Keller.
Just whilst people are reading, I'm going to interrupt. Yeah, Sylvina said students can take pics of their own community as well. She thinks it's a brilliant idea. Yeah, that's
really nice. And actually, I did. You know, I use quite a lot when I've done training with publishers about this. I've used lots of photographs. I mean, I've used photos of you know, family members' houses that might have accommodations in them, just to show how you can illustrate, because it's really important if you're representing a disabled person's home, that it and they say have mobility issues or whatever, that you accurately represent what their home is like, because they may have, you know, grab bars, there may be other adjustments or accommodations within their home to make it accessible to them. So if you're briefing, say you're writing a text for authors and editors about, or say you're briefing a disabled character for a photo story, you 100% have to go and do the research with real, actual living people with that impairment to find out what they need at home, what their homes look like, to make sure that you're creating a fully authentic representation. Do you think everyone's done reading?
Sylvina says text B is more inclusive and focuses on her achievements rather than on the disability.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's basically it. If we look at text 1, and this is loosely based on a real text that I've found. Text 1 starts with talking about her disability. It talks about what she can't do. You know, she can't communicate. It talks about her being helped to speak and read and write. And then like the achievements are tacked on at the end as if they're not very much. Whereas this text talks about her achievements first, then references her disability, but talks about how she she learned herself. She was, you know, it was a process that she did in order to learn to communicate. And then, as Sylvina said, talking about her achievements, but also like more fully her as a person, her life, her whole life story, and her beliefs. I think talking about beliefs really kind of brings somebody to life. You know, you're showing a part of them. So my message here really is that if you're creating a text about a disabled person, look at their whole life, look at them as a human being, a whole human being, and don't focus on the disability. You can include it, but don't focus on what people cannot do. Don't do it, don't show them being helped necessarily, you know, as somebody who's deserves pity, who's passive. And don't focus on the disability only. Any questions, Teresa, before I move on?
No questions. Just to cut. Okay. Yeah, other people have
said.
Does
that make sense?
Yeah. Rachel says that text B takes that person first approach.
Yeah.
And Dan adds, greater agency to Keller in text.
Yeah, totally. And it's just, you know, she's not this, she's a person, she's a whole person. So let's move on. So I want to think now about how we avoid that tokenism by including disability across a course or across the topics that, you know, you're teaching as a teacher. So if we just stick disability in social problems or sport modules, then it's going to A, problematize it, or B, just make it super tokenistic. So I think that you can include representations of disability within every single topic. So I want to I pulled out a few standard topics here, just to look at how we might do that. So if you're looking at social media or tech, you might have a text on social media etiquette, or, you know, you might have a faux Instagram post. So you could do something about how to write good alt text. So that's bringing in a representation of disability or accessibility issues in a very sort of integrated way without really focusing on disability. If you're talking about jobs, and I'm thinking about those typical kind of texts where you have 4 people talking about a day in their life of their job, just include 1 or 2 people who are disabled people. You don't need to even necessarily mention the disability because you're talking about their job, unless it's relevant. But it's just bringing disabled people into all these ordinary standard topics. If you're talking about films or books or TV, which we always do, you could feature films about disabled people by disabled people, or by disabled people. I would avoid, if you can, the trope of somebody reviewing the text, a non-disabled person reviewing the film and going, oh my God, aren't they cute? Because, you know, that's really not what we're going for at all. So I would even advise, if you're creating reviews of films and TV, to maybe have a disabled person reviewing that film, so that it's a disabled person's view of a similar impairment, if that makes sense. And then finally, inventions, standard ELT topic, but we can include inventions created by disabled people or for disabled people. So I've got one here. So we might have a text that's like 10 accidental inventions or 10 amazing inventions. And one of them could simply be an invention that references disability. So here we've got a text about the fidget spinner. We talk about the engineer, how she initially invented it as a toy for her daughter, but how later on people discovered that it was also good for people, autistic people, people with ADHD, and people with anxiety. So it's just gentle, incidental references to disability that add up to create a more inclusive reality, rather than these kind of pockets here and there. Finally, I want to look at some very kind of implicit, what I would call kind of implicit everyday representation. So if we think about the fact that disability is in every part of a disabled person's life, so that's not to say it affects everything the whole day, but it's just part of your life. So this is a scene that I've based on a family member. So here we've got a couple chatting, and A says, "Are you ready to go?" And B says, "Not quite. I just need to grab my wallet and my inhaler. Have you seen my wallet anywhere?" "Yes, it's in the kitchen." "Right, thanks." So we're just simply mentioning something that somebody with asthma would need to think about as part of their everyday life. And you can pull that out, you know, in the teaching notes. You could choose to go back and review the word inhaler. Then if you're a teacher, you might want to say, or even in the teacher's notes, do some project work around that. You know, have students go online, research what asthma is. They could even present about it. So we can have these kind of incidental representations, but then exploit them a little bit, you know, in the teacher's book or with further work. This one's also based on a family member. something that happened at the weekend. So, hello, how can I help you? Hi, I just wondered whether there were subtitles for Doom 3. Oh, no, sorry, there aren't any subtitles for that film. All right, well, thanks anyway. Sorry, bye. So again, it's representing something that a person with hearing loss might experience in their day-to-day life. So it's just bringing representations of disability into all of our texts, whether it be text, audio, or even video. This could be used for.
And so do you think it's, I guess it's kind of striking a balance between including it, and I like the word that you used, exploiting it, because I thought that the picture that you showed earlier of the woman checking for the diabetes, and that was the image that we used for the ad for this webinar. When I look at that, to me it looks like she's just looking at her phone or something. So I mean, do you think it's worth highlighting these things so that students become more aware of these things being included, or is it better for it to be more implicit?
I think it can be both. So I think you can just leave it there, but in the teacher's notes, I would always put a description of the disability that's being represented, because what we don't want is for a teacher to inadvertently use non-inclusive language to describe that image. So I would say put a photo description in the teacher's book. This image represents somebody doing X, Y, and Z. And I think then that supports the teacher using that material. And so if you're a teacher, you might want to go through that process with your students and explain what the photo is representing if you want to. But yeah, I think you could exploit it. Not every single time there's a disabled person, but I think if there's an optional activity, you could look at, say, okay, what's this photo representing? What do you know about diabetes? Do some research, present it, or, maybe students could write a role play. They could do some research and write a role play about an image, for example. There's lots of things, all the typical things you do with images, just do the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yep, great advice, yep.
Okay, so summing up, pretty much what I've already said: avoid a non-disabled norm, stereotypes, tropes, representation throughout the class or often in your class materials, and to avoid tokenism. A range of visible and invisible impairments. And if you're thinking about those invisible impairments, images are great, as we've seen, but also things like, discrete references in audio, discrete references in texts, different types of disabled people. Person first, focus on the person, not the impairment, and show disabled people as active, independent people, and that they're show them authentically, naturally, just living everyday lives, because around 15% of the world's population live with disabilities. And if we fail to exclude them, then we're really perpetuating the worst stereotype around disability, which is a stereotype of omission. Thank you.
Fabulous. Really, really interesting. Going back to kind of this idea of ELT materials being quite bland in the past, do you think, are there any cultural issues around representing disability?
Yeah, there definitely are. I mean, in certain cultures, disability is viewed as very problematic, or something, that carries a lot of stigma. So there's definitely, that's something to bear in mind. I think I'm not trying to evangelize. Well, I suppose I was fairly evangelical, but I appreciate that you have to adapt your materials for each specific context. So if you're living in a culture where disability is highly stigmatized, then you might want to reconsider or adapt how you would, approach, adapt what I've suggested for your own teaching context, or, the market that a book's being published in. So I think it's just it's about shifting that baseline. So if we start with thinking about a world that's both disabled and non-disabled, and considering how that relates to your teaching context or the market of the book, and kind of reaching a sort of happy medium. Does that make sense? Working out what will apply and what's relevant in that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is definitely needs to be a shift in ELT materials. I haven't come across anything with disability. Obviously with LGBTQIA, sometimes you might try and put a text in or something, and then when you get your drafts back, you see that's been changed to something that doesn't focus on that. We've had a lovely comment here from Dan. Thank you very much, Lottie. He has a question. Inhaler jumps out to me as an ungraded word. I'd fight the editor very hard to keep that in because it won't be on any word lists or EVP level. How can we prioritize the right words to help disabled people talk about their experiences where everyone's experience or disability is different? E.g., what words come in the first wave of words to teach? Wheelchair, inhaler, ramp, etc.
Oh my God, that's a really good question. I don't think, I'm really not sure how to answer that. I would have to give it some thought. I think if it's what comes up in what comes up for your teaching context if you're a teacher. But I would have to give that some serious thought when it comes to wider discussions about how we do that in ELT. I mean, I would just decategorize the whole lot of them. So if it's referencing disability, then make it ungraded. Is that answer your question, Dan?
Yeah. I mean, I think, like you say, it's a tricky question when you're put on the spot to kind of know what words would be the most useful. But like you say, I found it the other day, not thinking about disability, but thinking about jobs that might be more important in the future, and things like app designer. App isn't on a word list, but you kind of say, well, everybody uses apps, and people might be app designers in the future, so you have to kind of fight to put it in there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say fight, and I think I would ungrade all of them, and that's something that I'm personally trying to push for, because we say, oh well, the CEFR is based on frequency, but frequency for who? So yeah, no, that's something I would ungrade all of them, and I would push if you can with your editor. And there's maybe you would teach that within a vocab set before you put it in a listening, but I think in a reading text you can have a glossary, if that word is really so fundamentally challenging. But I think inhale plus ER is not actually that hard a concept, is it? So
Yep. Dan, he adds, I think it's a problematic question for publishers, but not for teachers, in that they can teach the words that are relevant and for their specific learners.
I think that's what helps with that kind of implicit approach, because if you had, say, the word inhaler in a text, if you didn't ask a question about that word and it wasn't interfering too much with intelligibility, you could have that word in there, if it wasn't going to raise too many alarm bells for the student, not test it, but then go back and mind that text, and that's where you might pull that word out, so it could be there without having a focus on it, so that level issue wouldn't be too horrible, and then you could go back and pull it out and work with it afterwards.
Yep. Fantastic. Well, we haven't had any more questions come in for the moment. Obviously, if you're watching this on catch up, do feel free to post a question, and if you tag Lottie or myself, then we'll definitely see it. Lottie, it's been such a wonderful talk. It's given me much to think about in terms of writing materials and trying to be a bit more inclusive in an implicit way. I think I've often gone for the inspiration porn a little bit, because not enough about how to do it well. So huge thank you. And one of the things I really loved was your comment about creating global citizens and those 21st century skills of empathy and understanding, which I think we need more of in the world in general, as well as in ELT materials. Fabulous. Well, again, huge thanks. Thank you to everyone who's been watching us this morning. And if you are watching on catch up, leave us a little thank you, a little hello. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.